very sluggish right now.
Okay, we should be live on my page.
All right.
Excellent.
Well, good evening, everybody. We're here with you again with the Dank Kingdom podcast. And tonight we're going to be continuing our conversation from a couple weeks ago about making sense of things, conspiracy theories, and so on. And talking partly about the appeal, like what is it that makes people believe things that on their face are absolutely preposterous? I mean, I know that the low-hanging fruit is something like flat Earth, which flies in the face of the science of the last 1,500 years. But people that believe this, and it has more to do with with their presuppositions or the way they view the world than it does with the actual facts that are in front of them. So we're going to be talking about some of that, of what drives some of these things, and kind of how we can think better, how we can think more clearly to understand what's really happening in the world in a way that's healthy, in a way that I guess helps us to show Jesus more to people. So that's kind of the direction that we're going tonight.
So why do people believe dumb stuff?
Well, we can clear the simplest explanation out of the way right away. It's not because they're dumb. Because lots of really smart people believe things that are disconnected from reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. It's in fact, there's a fair bit of intelligence in how convoluted some of these theories get. They're actually quite complicated.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just feel like there's something about wheels of logic that you can't get off of. I know we've mentioned it before, but this train that people get on where it happens in a lot of different ways, but when all your facts are proving your conclusion, here, let me say this. Why do we keep harping on this? It's come up on the DKP a lot. We talk about it a lot here. And it could look easy, like I think we were just trying to kick flat earthers and conservative bros around, which, don't get me wrong, that's a great sport. But that's not the point here. The point for me in discussing these particular topics is that I'm suspicious of my own rationale and intellect. I want to know that the things that I think and believe have been vetted by some process aside from just it makes good sense to me.
Right.
And so learning mental hygiene, learning how to think through your own thoughts and be self-analytical and to evaluate yourself with some attempt at objectivity, some attempt at external input is a really critical skill, and one that I think sadly many Christians are often default on.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Christians are notable in some way for that above other people? Are religious people more that way than other people?
I would assume that religious people are, especially people who have religious experiences, because I don't know who said it, but a man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument. Like if you have experiential knowledge or some kind of subjective experience that equates to personal proof, then your ideas have to conform with that, or you live in some kind of cognitive dissonance. And people don't like to live in cognitive dissonance. We'll flip the world upside down rather than deal with, hey, do you guys ever see those old Moody science films? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't think so.
I've heard of them, but I don't think I ever saw one.
They're fantastic. You should look them up on YouTube. They're the coolest science experiments. They're in black and white film, most of them, I think. And they did really cool science stuff back in the 50s and 60s. One of them they did, this guy strapped on a set of optics onto his face that inverted the image. So everything was upside down.
Oh, I know that
for them
experiment.
for like 2 days. And after about 12 hours, your brain flips the image.
Yeah.
And so everything's
Mhm.
right side up again, and he's operating normally, but he's got these optics on his face. And then when he takes them off, now the world that's right side up is upside down, and he's
Mhm.
got to go through another
Mhm.
12-hour orientation process where his
Mhm.
brain has to flip the image back around. And that's I mean, if we do that with optic nerve input, like the amount of lengths that we can go to reduce cognitive dissonance, to make sense of our world,
Mhm.
just tremendous. And so the ability we have to ignore facts and to peruse and especially when you're convinced of the end. And I think that's why religious people are probably more prone to this, is because it's not about the details, it's more about the consequence. And so I
Mhm.
think there's a prima facie idea with religion that it's the end that matters. And so between here and the end, whether that's heaven or nirvana, everything else has to fit in because it's the end of the equation that I'm after. So I
Yeah.
think that makes us disposed to being less than faithful to incorporating information and data that doesn't square well with our preconceived ideas.
My dad's fond of telling a story back, I think it was the Middle Ages, when, of course, you know, the philosophers of the ancient Greeks and so forth, the ancient Romans, did a lot of thinking about how the world should be, but not a lot of actual experimentation. They had their, you know, these things that made sense because of their worldviews and so forth, and as they philosophized it out. And according to the story that Dad told, and I don't have a source on this, if somebody wants to question it, you know, I'll just say the story is told. So I'm covered there. But supposedly this group of
Sorry.
Scientists or doctors or whoever got together and dissected this dog. And discovered that the dog's innards and its internal systems and organs were nothing like the Roman doctor Galen had said they ought to be. Well, this was really disconcerting to them because Galen's like this big name, you know, you can't argue with him. So after wrestling with it for a while, they came to the conclusion must have been something wrong with the dog. And that is such a common approach that people have is, and unfortunately it can even be to the point, like you said about your experience, Matthew, that a man with an experience is you know, is never helpless to a person that has an argument. But when you have your worldview that something is this way, like even your experiences, you interpret through that lens. I've actually heard of people that were asked, you know, flat earthers who were asked, well, what if somebody would take you in a rocket and fly you up to the moon and you could be there? And one of them was like, well, with everything NASA can do, with the way they can fake everything, I would just assume that they had some type of virtual reality that they faked this, or, you know, this is
Right.
for some people, this is a demonic delusion, you know, so some demon did this to me. Well, you can't even argue. Like at that point, you've placed yourself completely beyond any type of ability to even process or reason your way through something. And obviously that's an extreme case, but there's your fundamental presuppositions and your causes. Blaise Pascal said, you know, the heart has reasons that the mind knows nothing of. And a lot of times when you start drilling down to that, like what's actually driving this, it helps understand why people can be so irrational. One of the things is I've watched some videos and listened a little bit. Why are these theories so attractive? And one is because they provide a way of making sense of the world.
Right.
Because otherwise, and that's what happens anytime you have some horrific thing happen. You have some crime, or you realize somebody goes into a shopping mall and shoots 75 people, or somebody, you know, commits some kind of gruesome murder. The first question everybody asks is why? Why did he do that? What's his motive? There has to be some reason why, and it's terrifying to us to think. Like the most horrifying stories to me, if I read some crime story, is the ones that are truly random, where somebody just did something just because they did it, and there's no other reason. There's no reason they picked that person. There's no reason why. They were just driving down a street and they pulled a gun out, pulled a shot out the window at just some random person, because it reminds you that you live in a world where anything horrible can happen and there's no way you can protect yourself from that. And when we see like COVID-19 and you have terrorism, you have the fears of, you have rioting, all these different things that people feel like the world has just gone crazy and there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no, anything could happen. And it's more comforting, paradoxically, to think, well, there's actually some super powerful force behind the scenes that's working all this stuff out. And then you're able to align yourself against that force and be heroic in the process, because now you're aligned against this and you're actually making the world a safer place. And that illusion, especially when sticking it to that evil force, requires nothing more than hitting share on Facebook. I mean, it's a win for your mental health in at least one sense or in one level.
I'm curious if what we're experiencing is a modern and postmodern phenomenon, based on a few speculations. 20th century media and expectations about story resolution, especially now that we have very visceral media, the idea of watching a movie or watching a television show in my generation, summing up a story in 30 minutes and making sense of the world in these neat little packages. I wonder what that does when you grow up on that. And then hyper individualism and a lack of a sense of meaning in life, like all those things. Now, I don't know that all those things would apply to the circles that we run in, but as a modern phenomena, I wonder if it is a modern phenomena that the conspiracy crowd and the propensity to see myself as some kind of like shining knight fighting the powers of darkness from my basement and my keyboard and my speculations about the logo of commodities and Wayfair catalogs and whatever else comes up. Like it's my own personal Batman identity. Like I'm this knight figuring things out. And I wonder if all those pop culture phenomenon help feed this.
Yeah. And even the prevalence of movies where nobody stumbles on some horrific conspiracy and everybody thinks they're crazy. I mean, you can't turn around without running into that in a novel or a TV or movie or whatever. That's an incredibly common trope. Right. And for people then to identify themselves with that hero, that they're the ones who are doing this. One thing, and I don't know, maybe I'm doing the meme thing where I'm exiting the interstate here, but this is a dog I really feel like needs kicked while we're talking about this subject. And that is the realization that there is a huge number of these conspiracy theories that are rife with anti-Semitic tropes. And you've got to understand that. Some of these conspiracy theories are ancient conspiracy theories that are just getting retreaded and reformed, but it's the same thing. They have anti-Semitic roots.
Right.
Just go and let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. Is if you just go and read the Wikipedia article Blood Libel, Libel, blood libel. The whole concept of blood libel is an ancient idea. It goes back into the Middle Ages, and a lot of Jews got killed over this thing. A Gentile child would disappear, Catholic child or whatever, child in the city, and they would say, well, some Jews stole them, and there were these stories that went around that these Jews would take little children, kidnap them from the Gentile community, and drain their blood and use it in their Passover meals, their matzos, and all these kind of things, or use them for various rituals in their Jewish faith. And this was often what would spark pogroms, where they would go into a Jewish community and burn the place down and kill a lot of them and all this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But this idea of these evil masterminds who are preying on your children and draining their blood and torturing. All these things, these stories go back centuries. This isn't a new thing. Now, if you're a conspiracy theorist, well, you say, well, that just shows how old these conspiracies are. This has been going on for all these years. Epstein wasn't the first one to do this. You could play that game if you'd like, or you can look and say, this is something people realize has resonated with people for a long time, and they're using this same thing to dupe people again and again into pointing at their common enemy. Mm-hmm. And that and the anti-Semitism that pops up from time to time within the conservative bro, not so much conservative bros, conspiracy bro community is really ironic to me, especially because they're always warning us that they're saving us from the Nazi.
Right.
And really, a lot of these type of things, I mean, that was the whole secret cabals, Jewish people killing children and drinking their blood and all this kind of stuff was a major part of Nazi propaganda. Go look it up in the source of your choice. But go look it up. That was a legit thing that the Nazis did. And we're watching this whole thing get set up again. And it's frankly terrifying to me how many people are actually buying this stuff. Because if you actually believe this, you are willing to do almost anything to stop that from happening. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm just showing this. This is the modern take on that blood libel. Is this adrenochrome stuff, like children being kidnapped to feed the wealthy, who are also probably, if you get down this rabbit hole, all Jews controlling the media.
Yes.
This is exactly this kind of stuff, just in modern clothes.
Right, and you have to be absolutely aware you drill down to the bottom of this, and there is absolutely anti-Semitism at the core of this.
And anti-Semitism is easy because Jews are a people group that are well represented among influential positions. Like, that's kind of a fact of the world. And so they make an easy target for, if you're going to promote a conspiracy like that. But it goes beyond that, is that if you train people to uncritically believe libels like that, that's a cannon you can turn on anyone with very little extra effort.
Well, they did it with the Bolsheviks in Germany to round people up. They did it in Indonesia. I was just learning. I want to give a shout out. I like to give recommendations to people who are interested in the things we talk about. I've been listening to Oliver Stone's series on American history. It's really, really good. I take a pretty critical view of American empire, and there's lots of stuff in his really thorough miniseries on 20th century, mostly American history, that's really phenomenal. Like, I was unaware. I knew about Suharto and the Indonesian dictatorships that the U.S. was propping up, but I didn't realize how extensive the purges were in Indonesia, or in Greece for that matter under Papadopoulos. But in Indonesia in particular, the U.S. and Australian intelligence agencies were sending the Indonesian dictator reports of suspected communists, and they slaughtered anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million Indonesians in the purges. That kind of stuff has been played out in the Cold War. Like this, it really is an old hat. Like you just pick the enemy, and then you can call whoever you want to dispose of that enemy, or just hype up the people with the fervor of the fear of that enemy. And it really goes hog wild. And sometimes you tip over a scale with that kind of fervor that you can't pull back from.
You can't put it back in. I mean, it's been an ongoing problem I've been reading about for a while in Asia. I think in particular it's been an issue in India that rumors will be spread on WhatsApp, which isn't it can't be censored very well, and these rumors are spread that so and so did so and so and so is linked with the enemy, so and so kidnapped children, and a mob will just show up and start beating or killing people on the basis of those rumors. And people need to understand that when you promote things for which there is no evidence, just because it just taps viscerally into something you want to believe, you have blood on your hands if that results in violence. And I think it's been so long since most of us in this country have actually seen that kind of out of control violence running amok, that it's hard for people to understand how high the stakes are.
Yeah.
Why do you think that
being
in
irresponsible.
American, the most recent example that we have in our contemporary history would be the McCarthy era blacklisting? Why didn't that turn into purges in America, do you think?
It seems like it just wasn't able to get far enough advanced. There was
Just
enough
didn't hit the tipping point.
There was enough counterweight to it, enough forces that the reaction to it seems to have been strong enough, early enough that it didn't.
That is
get that far.
actually, excuse me, that is actually the thing that people talk about, how divided America is. And that is actually one thing that gives me hope that it's possible to avoid reaching that tipping point, is just simply that it's really close to 50% of the population
Right.
thinks the other 50% are nuts. And when you have that, you don't have any strong majority that says, hey, let's go and kill the other ones. And in fact, we saw this happen with the Black Lives Matter riots. Is that as soon as it started getting violent, there were some people who still said, well, hey, rioting and violence under these circumstances is permissible. But the bulk of people are like, if you're going to go violent, we're not interested in supporting this.
Right.
We're not, that's actually where pushback starts happening, when it goes into violence.
Right.
And it really feels like overall, and maybe that Overton window shifting toward violence in a way that's concerning. I think that's happening, but overall, it feels like there's still that balance that's happening. That I have hope. The U.S. is a unique nation as well. I mean, the amount of area that it has. It's not like the French Revolution or Germany, where this is happening in a pretty contained area. You could even have a massive flare-up of violence in one area, but the idea of it crossing over all 3,000 miles of the United States just seems really difficult to imagine that actually being possible to happen because of the overall ballast that's there.
Well, I think it's really easy to forget that the United States is a really artificial construct. So you start talking about the United States, or we're trained to think of the United States as if it's a single unit, and it really isn't. It's a fairly always has been a fairly fragile confederation of different states, all of which cling fiercely to their degree of autonomy that they've managed to hold on to. And different regions of the United States have very different types of populations, people with different ethnic backgrounds, people with different visions for what they want the lives of their children to look like. And so I wouldn't be confident that the fact that the nation is 50-50 would prevent an outbreak of violence, because most parts of the nation are very far from 50-50. Like where I live, there's Oklahoma's a really red state. So is Arkansas. I was talking
to the concept of a national purge, like the French Revolution, reign of terror.
Right, where someone would seize the nation's government. But I mean, if you take a state the size of France and have something like that happen in it, the disaster is the same. Is on the same scale.
Right.
And so I think we need to not be too confident because of the national demographics, but also on where the Overton window is. I think on a positive note, my impression is that I've seen it shift even in my lifetime, where there is just in general less taste for violence, more pushback against violence, more of a sense among the whole population, or at least a larger percentage of the population, who just don't want don't think there's a good reason to do violence. Like violence is, there was a time when it was relatively popular, say in academic circles, to promote the idea that war was inherently good for the species. And like ideas like that are completely, those are completely marginalized today. And so I think there is, I would say that overall in the Western world, my impression from my reading of history and my observations today is that the Overton window has shifted away from violence overall. And of course it goes back and forth on the short-term scale, but and we're probably definitely moving back toward violence at the moment. But in general, it's harder, especially in the Western world, for a situation to reach that flashpoint, because there's just so much more ingrained conscience against just going out and killing people because you're angry at them.
Yeah. Well, you were dealing with French Revolution. You were actually dealing with the state was meting out public executions left and right for fairly minor offenses, and so when the glue of society came apart, those people were just doing what they were used to seeing happen. And I mean, that was just a natural thing, except you just had different people behind the guns, behind the knives, and so forth.
Right. There's just less. There's less tolerance of that kind of raw, like self-interested partisan violence than there used to be. I'm quite confident, and that's because of the influence of Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely the leavening of the gospel. I would be interested in seeing, like, is there? It seems like there's been an acceleration, because if you think from the 1500s to the 1800s of what it would have been as far as tolerance for violence and stuff, it doesn't seem like there was that much change in the level of barbarity in people. But then, go ahead.
Statistically, there. I don't know how these statistics are gathered, but the estimates I've seen for, say, murder rates, like various forms of violence, almost any way you measure violence, like since the 1700s, there has been a steady and radical decrease. People just are killing each other less and less and less and less with every passing century. So I would push back on that, as far as there being there are obvious anomalies in that trend, like the world wars. But if you look at percentages like per capita violence in the world, it's been dropping for a long time and fairly steadily.
Steven Pinker, Better Angels of Our Nature, is the good research point, at least at a popular level, for that kind of stuff.
So it's not like it's been a dramatic swing in the last 100 years or whatever.
No, in fact, it's probably the opposite. Although what I think about America in particular, that's speaking worldwide. So obviously there's been horrible atrocities all throughout the years, and there still are. But that seems to be, in proportion to world population, seems to be less and less common. The likelihood of being murdered in your lifetime is dropping significantly as time moves forward. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. Resource allocation and access is probably a huge part of it. But anyhow, there's whole books written on that. What I'm interested in American history, especially current contemporary American history, is that there seems to be these popular epochs where we reach a crescendo. It seems like the 20s and 30s are, the Prohibition era, and violence is really it really reaches a peak. And then you have the war years, and everybody's kind of like tired of that. Like, we're tired of violence, like enough. And then that ebb kind of lasts till about the 60s. Now there's all of our wars in Korea and everything else going on during that time. But as far as domestically, the 60s then go off the rails. Like you had, I think that Stone documentary said that there were 75 race riots in one year. It was the year that Kennedy ran against Nixon, I think. 75 race riots. And like in I think Detroit, 40 some African Americans were shot in the Detroit race riots, and like 20 something in LA. Like they were killing dozens of people. And then the Kent State Six got killed. The president gets shot. Like all this, the stuff in the 60s seems like a real pinnacle of violence in popular culture.
Yeah.
And then now it's on the wane again. And one wonders, is there a cyclical nature to popular violence, to how readily acceptable violence is within the culture? And does it reach these pinnacles and ebbs and flows? And I don't know the answer to that, but if you take a quick survey, it looks like there's some peak points where I guess going all the way back, even before Prohibition, there's wholesale slaughter in labor activism. They're machine gunning mine workers and things. So, and that's publicly known. I mean, news has to travel slower back then, but it's not like it was in a backwater and nobody knew about it. It just was.
Yeah, and it didn't cause the overthrow of the existing government or anything. It was
right.
So yeah, and what you see, there does seem to be a cyclical nature, and I'm sure it has something to do with just the way human memory works.
Right.
Like once we don't remember how bad violence was,
right,
because of the tendency of parties and governments to glorify violence. If you haven't seen much of the real thing, it sounds like fun. Then
right.
you get into a period where you start experiencing it, and everybody goes like, "This is horrible. We don't want to see this anymore." And they're highly motivated to come up with other alternatives for a while until that memory fades. But what you see also, the trend is that each time it drops off, it drops lower than the time before, and
right.
each peak is, most of the time the peaks are not as high as the previous peaks were. And so each spike in violence feels really bad compared to what came before. And due to the growth of the population, we may actually have more net suffering from violence going on, more people experiencing violence than, earlier in the 20th century or whatever. Which is, how do you weigh the significance of that? But it does mean, like you said, that for any person being born on this planet, the chance of being murdered, or experiencing some other kind of incredible deprivation is
right.
lower than at any point in history.
So this is a kind of a segue into something that I think ties in really closely with this. Because this conversation we're having certainly sounds like the world's getting better and better. And personally, I believe that's objectively true. But you have the apocalyptic crowd, which a lot of conspiracy theories are basically the modern equivalents of apocalyptic cults.
Right.
That goes against everything. Like, the whole trajectory is that it's getting worse. It's got to get worse and worse. It's got to get more horrible. Eventually, they're going to put microchips on all of us, and we'll have to worship the beast or the chop our heads off, and all this kind of thing, which is the stereotypical American dispensationalism idea, which I don't think any of us three would espouse in any way, shape, or form. So what is the response then to the passages in Scripture, for instance, where it talks about evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, and those type of things, that there seems like there's an indication of a ramping up of evil. But then if you read history, I was just talking to my dad the other day, and he quoted that verse, and he said, some of the wickedness that 100 years ago, would not have been acceptable. I think in some of the promiscuity and things, he said, some of the stuff that was acceptable 100 years ago, isn't dreamed of today. And I said, you mean like setting black people on fire? That wasn't what he was thinking of. He was thinking of, like I said, some of the promiscuity. But then I said, well, if you look at the Roman Empire and the things that went on there, anything that's happening in the U.S. today is like tame
they were doing
compared
it worse,
to.
yeah.
You know, so what is that verse talking about then? What do we make of that? What's a response to that of actually having a positive view of the future, that the kingdom of God is going forward, that the kingdoms of men even are being leavened by the gospel, and that violence is decreasing and all these kind of things. I lean post millennial, so I don't have a problem with that, but I'm kind of curious where you guys are at with that.
Well, I'll give a response quickly, and then I'm sure Matthew has a bunch to say on it, but I think for me, when I match that up with what I observe in the world, is that as the world actually, as the light of Christ, as there are more and more people representing the Messiah in the world, more and more people announcing the King, more and more examples of an alternative way of life being created, and there are in the world today, the more the light spreads, the more wicked you have to be in order to continue to resist it. And so when you look at, for instance, mainstream Christianity today, I think if you look at rank and file followers of the comfortable, politically connected, selfish religion that calls itself Christianity, it appears to me that they are more virulently anti-God than they have ever been before, because they are having to dig in their heels to maintain their position. There's a much broader awareness in, say, at least in American Christianity today, of what Jesus actually taught and how that doesn't line up with much of what's happening in the church, and many voices calling for us to rediscover the teachings of Jesus and act on them. And when that happens, and people who have not been doing that are faced with the truth, they have to either be persuaded, or they have to dig in their heels and double down on everything that was wrong with their thought process in the first place. Things that they were subconsciously believing, but had never really thought about. Now they think they have to think about them. And if they don't reject them, they have to say, oh, you know what? I never thought about how weird it is that I believe exactly the same thing about redemptive violence that ISIS does. That's kind of cool. That's what you have to do.
That makes a lot of sense.
So evil men have to get worse as the light gets brighter, or they can't stay evil men anymore. So I think that's at least on one level what we see happening.
It's a little, and maybe a little bit like the parable of the wheat and the tares, where he says, let them grow up together. Well, the closer you get to the harvest, the more obvious it is that the wheat is wheat, and the more obvious it is that the tares are tares.
Yeah. The distinction becomes clearer and starker.
That makes a lot of sense. Appreciate that.
I like that idea. I think there's a lot of truth in that. So I think if I had to peg us, Dave, you're a self-confessed post-millennialist, which is really a species of amillennialism. Anthony, you're a run-of-the-mill amillennialist. Is that what I'm?
No. Well, why would you say that? Because I believe that Jesus is going to reign in Jerusalem.
Hey,
look, there's Titus.
Hey.
Look at you, man.
Yeah.
He's in deep shade, but he's here.
Welcome to the DKP.
No, I believe in an actual kingdom, Matthew. I believe in the actual reign of Christ. I just don't believe it comes in the same form that the other ones do. That it's necessary for the big end time showdown and all this kind of stuff.
Well, I just mean in a technical sense, like the reign and its physicality and juxtaposition to the judgment is how we define those terms. So premillennial is the reign before the judgment on earth, and amillennial is that there's not a reign, or it's a figurative reign, and postmillennial would be a species of not a physical reign, or a reign after the judgment.
Okay. I guess maybe I misunderstood what postmillennial is, but basically I believe that, well, the Bible talks in the book of I think it's one of the Peters about hastening the coming of Christ.
Right.
That it's possible that what we're doing actually makes him come sooner.
Right.
And I feel like as John the Baptist was a forerunner and he came to, you know, make straight in the highway paths for God, that as the gospel is spread and as the world becomes more and more the kingdom of Christ, I think at some point a tipping point comes where the world is prepared to receive Christ as king, and then Christ descends and comes and reigns over a world that still has kings that can bring their glory into the city and still has all those things. What I object to is the necessity of this, you know, this end times antichrist and all this. I view all those things as in that sense, I'm a partial preterist. I believe those those.
Don't tell Rebecca.
Yeah. Well, why is she anti-preterism?
She
No, I
just
believe
said,
those.
she just posted, "I'm so glad I woke up for preterism to be blasted to pieces."
Uh-oh.
So no, I believe those things were fulfilled. I believe there's really good evidence that those things were fulfilled in the first century, as far as Revelation and so forth is concerned.
So I'm squarely a historic premillennialist. To what extent I engage in the issue, which isn't a ton. It's mostly a default setting. I abandoned premillennialism when I left the evangelical world. It didn't make sense anymore without all those other constructs. And so, eschatologically homeless, I came across patristic writings that were the earliest of the patristic writings seemed to be in favor of premillennialism. So that's where I ended up. And don't spend a lot of time engaging with the issue much past that. Although Regnum Caelorum is on my shelf, I haven't got to it yet. So, but where was I going with that? Trying to figure out where we're all at. Oh, yeah. These issues. Yeah. Evil in the world. I for me as a premillennialist, I can play apocalyptic. Like I do see some kind of run up in the last days, and how that squares with the pacification of human society. I don't know exactly. I think that you're right, Dave, that there are certain things that Jesus does seem to place squarely in the hands of the church to do to hasten his coming, like declaring the gospel to all nations. Like that's something that seems like it's designed to motivate us to do something for a result. And so the fact that we're engaging with the eschaton to bring it about is a sensible conclusion from those things to me. And I think as that time draws near, there'll be systems that rise up in opposition, and it'll create conflict in the end of days. And I think those are real physical conflicts, a real persecution, oppression of the church. But I have to confess my prejudice too, because I've always, since I was young, had a bent toward dystopian ideologies. Like dystopian literature, dystopian film has always, and I think probably because I was raised as a dispensationalist, this end of days horror that's going to come on the earth, especially for the people of God, kind of stokes those imaginations, and I don't know that that's all healthy.
Well, here's an interesting thought about American dystopian imagination. That is, right now, in certain parts of the world, Yemen, for instance, parts of Syria and Iraq still, people are living in a dystopia.
Right.
Like they don't have to imagine dystopia.
Right.
Dystopias really exist on Earth.
Right.
And the Earth as a whole, in many ways, is. I think when your eyes are open to see the world the way God sees it, we're already in a post-apocalyptic world in many ways. Like this world crashed into a terrible state of dystopia a long time ago. Humans who were supposed to, like this world has everything we need to live abundant, fruitful, peaceful lives. We could be exploring the solar system and far beyond by now with the resources that are on Earth, going far, hundreds of times farther than we have with science and literature and art, if we were living peaceably together all this time the way God intended us to. You know, our fruit trees would be, you know, bearing 5 times as much as they do. And all of these things, like, compared to how we were designed to live on this planet,
Right.
what we're doing with ourselves here is absolutely horrendous, frightful. It's a monstrous situation. And so the whole history of humanity is trying to crawl out of that dystopia, people regrouping, people trying to reconnect with God, who made this thing to work, and him finding people who can help him restore this situation. And so I think there's a lot less attraction for dystopian ideas as, you know, some sort of culmination, if you realize that that's the situation we're in already. And for many people, that's the idea. The idea of imagining dystopia would be absurd, because, you know, the exotic future they imagine is a future where they aren't living in a hideous waste where, you know, life is cheap and they can die anytime. And so
you're saying dystopian fascination is a luxury of people that aren't living in dystopias.
It is. It's a luxury of people who don't live in dystopias. And we actually, because we're tied together here, like, we're all breathing polluted air, and most of us are drinking polluted water and eating food with toxins in it. Like, we all share in this to some degree. It's just that some of us are, you know, in more sheltered spots on the planet, resource-wise or whatever. But the other thing I wanted to say is I do believe that there's likely some sort of showdown before Jesus returns to establish his kingdom. And that, once again, I think, you know, back to that idea that, you know, I'm open to some sort of Armageddon
Right.
scenario as well. But again, I see that as the same type of situation. If you're tracking a grizzly bear through the bush for 3 hours, and finally you corner it up in a, you know, up between some rocks,
It's going to come back at
the
you.
time when you're at highest risk of getting your head knocked off is those last few minutes when you're just about to take it out. It's when, I mean, Rene Girard has some great ideas about this too, but you know, Satan doesn't have to create, like, he doesn't want to tear down society. He can't play with it if he completely destroys it. So, you know, there's nothing to exercise your power over if you just leave nothing but shambles. So it's when he's out of options, when the evil powers realize their time is really short, and, you know, this idea is in the New Testament, that they begin to be really, really dangerous. As long as they have people mostly under their sway, you don't see them manifesting themselves in the most overt and frightening ways.
So then I don't, if that's your trajectory, then I don't have any issue with that concept. I don't have any issue with because what you're describing is an upward trajectory where, to Satan, the noose is continually tightening until it reaches the point where it's right at that tipping point, and there's the last gasp, like you said, grizzly bear charge to do as much damage as possible before the ultimate defeat. Where what's driving the fear and the dystopian ideas is that we're on a downward trajectory, and the kingdom of Christ is losing, and the noose is tightening for God's people until finally God comes and Deus Ex Machina, you know, ends everything. But not because he was able actually to win hearts and minds, just because he's the one that writes the rules, and so he's able to do it.
Well, he's essentially doing, like, you know, when a couple of kids are playing checkers and one of them sees that he's losing and he just wipes everything off the board.
Right.
I mean,
Exactly.
like that's not a win. So and that's not what the prophecies lead us to believe is going
Right.
to happen. That's not
That's yeah.
what the kingdom of God, that's not what's promised to us in the scope of history. But yeah, I have to put my children to bed. I guess my wife is not feeling well, and the children
Oh yeah.
are
Well,
needing put to bed. So I'm going to have to cut this a little bit short. I was going to say one more thing about it, but about that before I dropped off, but now I forget what it was. So I guess I'll say good night.
all right.
So what I'm curious about before you go is if Titus meant to listen to the podcast and ended up clicking the link to join the podcast.
It looks
Are you
like
there,
Titus isn't
Titus?
sure what he's doing here.
Yeah.
He's coming and going.
All right. Well, thanks, Anthony. Do you want to stick around for a few minutes, Dave, before we sign off?
Yeah, there was one thing that I wanted to kind of address that Anthony talked about. And if you've got to go, Anthony, maybe
Well, it's actually I have a few minutes
Okay.
before they need to be.
basically, I just wanted to touch really quickly on how this ties into understanding what the gospel really is. Because you said about, we already live in a dystopia. We could be somewhere with art and science and music and all these things. But for so many people, none of that has to do with the kingdom of God. That the idea that the kingdom of God is about making the world a better place, about improving science, about improving all those are worldly pursuits.
Mhm.
Being a Christian and doing kingdom work is essentially becoming a mind virus where, I go and infect a couple people with the virus of faith, and then they go infect some more people. And that's my job, is to infect the whole world with Jesus.
Mhm.
And
except the world's getting infected with evil faster, so I don't
right,
really have a chance.
and there's that. And so that idea that the kingdom of God is actually a really, and I know this is really a buzzwordy word to use, but I don't really know any other word to say than holistic. It's something that's there not just for the heart or the mind, but it's about restoring culture and restoring society, restoring relationships to how Jesus would have us to live. And he created the world to be inhabited. It says that. He didn't create the world to be empty. He created it to be inhabited. He created it to be full of music and full of life and full of all these different things. And I think that lack of understanding of the gospel leads then to all these other issues that we're talking about, because we don't understand the full nature of what it means to be part of God's kingdom. And we've so many religious organizations have narrowed it down to this mental assent to a list of ideas, and then we go on and okay, we've checked our boxes, or in some cases, we live ascetically enough that God looks at us and says, okay, he's really bearing his cross real good, so I guess he's good. We're gonna, and there's so much more to it than that.
Well, I mean, maybe this is a good time to give a little shout out to Gnostic dualism. I mean, that's what's behind this whole misunderstanding of what God is doing in the world, and why people have the idea that the world cannot be redeemed, that it has to get worse and worse and finally be discarded, because the idea is that the material world is short-lived, it's doomed. Material physical life for humans is a temporary situation, and what matters is the soul, which is something immaterial, and we're all going out of here when it's the future is us leaving Earth and living forever in an immaterial existence in heaven. And
Cosmic
so
escapism.
That error is why we shouldn't get tattoos.
Exactly.
Hey, I'm here, guys.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep, that brought him out.
We finally got some input from Titus.
I'm driving, so you might not be able to hear me very well. But,
We can hear you.
okay,
I mean, you don't
cool.
sound great, but yeah. But
Thank you.
yeah,
Must be tattoo poisoning.
what's that?
It must be tattoo poisoning.
That's definitely, yeah.
You have cashew poisoning?
Tattoo poison.
Tattoo poisoning must be getting to my vocal cords.
Yeah, well, I hope not.
Hmm.
But the yeah, so I mean, what the scripture teaches, what my understanding of what the early Christians expected was that Jesus would, the ultimate plan for us at the resurrection was about us ultimately living together with Jesus in charge on a restored earth.
Real
And
bodies.
in bodies that are more physical and more real than the ones we have now. I was just listening to N.T. Wright, so I might have a few N.T. Wrightisms in the next few weeks, but yeah, he says in comparison to the body we have now, our new body in comparison to the one we have now will be like the body we have now in comparison to a ghost.
That's really neat. I like that.
that
That's very Great Divorce.
yeah, exactly. And so if we believe, and it's a very, the resurrection means that what we're doing here actually counts. Something is going to happen in the future that has continuity with what we're doing now. So the beautiful things we create, the people we bless, the programs we start to enhance our surroundings and the people we love, those things all carry on. They are going to echo into eternity. We don't leave them behind. So if we trash this planet, I mean, the Apostle Paul talks about people that will they'll be saved through fire. All their work will burn, and they'll just barely come out, with themselves intact. So if we love God and we are having some sort of relational experience with Him, but we haven't grasped what He's even about, we've essentially remained in a child state our whole lives, just tagging around with Dad, but never figuring out what he was doing, never listening when he said what he was doing, never trying to understand what his work was. Then whatever we spent our lives doing is going to be, maybe meaningless in the next life. So if we get on board with what God's actually cares about, which has everything to do with justice and peace and constructively blessing the world that we live in, then we get to have work that holds up in the fire and passes through the fire and comes out the other side looking even better. And we can keep on working on it. And that's a really hopeful thing. And I'll just give a shout out to a J.R.R. Tolkien work, that a story that's really good on that specific subject. I don't agree with everything that he suggests in this story, so that's a disclaimer. There's maybe some sort of form of purgatory hinted at, but the idea that things are carried on into that we carry on, our work matters in the next life. It's called Leaf by Niggle, and I can drop it in a comment later.
Great.
But look it up. It's a great story. And
So that's the big complaint in Ecclesiastes, is he says life is meaningless because a guy works all his life and then he dies and somebody else gets it and it's pointless. And he goes through, all these different things that happen, time and chance happens and it's pointless. Somebody does their best and whatever, and then they get hit by a bus and they, they're cut off in the middle and it's pointless. Life is pointless. Life is meaningless. And that's because it's a life that doesn't have the resurrection at the end of it, and the new world and the new life to come.
Right. And the great thing about this Tolkien story is that you get that complete sense of Ecclesiastes' futility at the beginning of it, and then it opens out, and that's So
yeah, definitely drop that. I'd like to read that.
So I think to wrap this all up in a nice little package, we can say that apocalyptic conspiratorial outlooks where we're afraid of the world around us are really a faithless position. That
Yes.
what it means to be a participant of the gospel is to be an overcomer, is to not be afraid of the world, but to be transforming and changing the world around me. And not just that I'm baptizing 20 people a year, but that I'm being God's active force in my world, in my sphere of influence, to bring about light and hope and peace and health and life. And that makes me strong. It makes me not afraid. It makes me equipped to deal with the things that aren't that, equipped to deal with the things that are emblems and representatives of death and destruction and sin and unrighteousness. And in that conflict, I'm no more afraid of those systems and powers and need no more fear them or run from them than the light switch needs run from the darkness.
Good.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that, you know, the reason people buy into like really dark, twisted stories of reality that fill them with anxiety and dread, and we've seen so much of this in the last few months, this just sense that everything's going south, and
Right.
you know, that the reason we buy a story like that is because we don't have a better story to believe in. And we have to be part of a story. We have to have a narrative that makes sense of our lives. And if we don't have if our narrative was, if our faith narrative was a shallow one that was like, oh, God has chosen this country to bless, and I'm living in the best country in the world, and everything goes great for us because we're blessed by God, and then suddenly everything isn't going great for us,
Then we need Trump to fix it.
right? And then he doesn't fix it, and you know, a virus comes along that we didn't know was going to happen, and he's completely unequipped to, you know, rise to the occasion. And when those sorts of things happen, we have to come up with another narrative on the fly. And if we don't have an overarching story, if we don't understand the story that the scripture is telling us about who we are, about where the world is going, and our dominant, you know, our dominant narrative that we fit into is linked to these temporary changing, you know, empires and power structures, then we're constantly off balance. We're constantly feeling lost and distressed and stressed out and anxious. We need to get back to the story that Jesus is telling, which is that he's winning. He's come into the world to transform it. He's creating a new kingdom, and that kingdom is growing. And that kingdom is stronger than whatever dark powers are in the earth. And the ultimate outcome of the situation that we're in now is that it's going to win. We are not going to leave behind a legacy of a world where God has lost because we didn't get enough people to vote for the right, you know, for the right political leaders or something like that. We don't have to have that kind of existential dread about the world we live in. It's God's world, and he's taking it back. And when we get a hold of that story, then all of a sudden we're above these temporary changes, things like pandemics and political shifts and you know, even revolutions and wars. We see all those things from a higher perspective, and they don't shake our faith anymore.
So I have a proposition. It's interesting to me that all three of us have somewhat modified different eschatology perspectives, but we are approaching this all from the same perspective because the central thesis is the gospel and the kingdom, and how that culminates in the eschaton doesn't matter as much. But what I would say is that the conspiracy bros and conserva bros that we are typically used to calling apocalyptics are not actually apocalyptics, because apocalypse implies both revelation and resolution. I think that a more appropriate term would be a cataclysmicist, like cataclysmics, not apocalyptics, because they're just chicken littles. They're just woe is me. They're just worried about the problem at hand. They're not actually seeing the revelation or the resolution that comes through the gospel.
Well, there is the eventually Jesus is going to come and he's going to pour out all these bowls of wrath on everybody and smite the tar out of them, and eventually ride in on his horse and slaughter them all, and we're going to sit there and laugh because they've had it coming for all this time, and finally it's happening, and yeah, he's killing them, like, is what needs to happen. So they do have that thing to look forward to. Or like the one comment that I saw recently where somebody had a post of a woman in somebody's face and said something along the lines of, what would Jesus do in this situation? And one of the comments was along the lines of, well, he'd smile because in a couple of years she's going to die and go to hell anyway. And that's the attitude.
Yeah, which is demonic.
Yeah. And it's completely like, that's not what winning means to Jesus.
Right.
And the other
because
thing,
it's based on physical power is the resolution.
Right.
It's based on destruction of the other,
Yeah.
rather than redemption. So yeah, the other thing that maybe I might mention is that I think when you understand that God loves this world and he's going to redeem it, it sets you free from what I think was somewhat of a guilt, kind of background guilt in my upbringing, which was that I loved the world. Like the earth at its best, it's a beautiful place. It's stupendous. It's like,
Yeah.
There's no way a human being can get tired of this planet. If we had the freedom to just, people who do have the freedom to just explore and discover endlessly, never get tired of it. This world is an amazing place to live. And if you love it, you don't have to feel guilty about that. That's how you're supposed to be. You're not made for somewhere else. You're
Right.
made for this place. And one day heaven and earth are going to seamlessly come together, and you're going to see the earth the way that it was supposed to be seen, and the way we're going to live in it, the way we were supposed to live in it. And I don't know if we're going to still, stumble across the ruins of, Detroit, or in the parks here and there, or not. But I
Well, if
think
the Great
that,
Divorce were real, it happened in Detroit, I promise you.
Yeah.
but yeah,
Well, the higher up and
so
further in, right?
yeah.
Like the
But
last
like
battle.
those best instincts that we have, those things that we feel like when we stand and look at a mountain range, or gaze at the stars or whatever, that's because we're made for this place, and this place is made for us, and God loves it as much as we do. So we don't need to feel bad about our instincts. Like, we should not be suppressing our instincts to make this world better. That's exactly how God wants us to think.
Right. It's not a throwaway world.
Right.
And we probably in a future episode ought to clarify all the questions that are going to arise about about whether we're just saying, oh, Christianity is just working to make the world better, because it's not that.
Well,
that's
yes,
involved.
but actually, no.
And there's I don't know how many of you know, but Charlton Swayze's over in Kampala. He's a good friend of mine. They have a podcast that they've been doing. It's By Our Love, I think is the name of it. And he did several episodes, him and Brother Jan LaRue, who was he was at I-58 for several years. They did a whole series in their podcast on theology of ecology that was really good, about those exact issues, how we should look at the created world and the different views and a comparison and contrast. So if you get a chance,
Wow.
check out Charlton's By Our Love on theological ecology.
Also, if you're interested in a further unpacking of some of the ideas we talked about here, that I think some of the core ideas that we all three agree on, N.T. Wright's "Surprised by Hope" is a great discussion of those things, and it's like, I don't endorse everything that he believes, but the core of it is solid, I believe, and
Mhm.
and it will, if these ideas sound new to you at all, will definitely shift your paradigm.
Right.
Yeah, How God Became King is another one by Wright that's excellent.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
All right.
Titus,
Good
it was
night.
nice to see your truck.
Yeah, it was nice
Yes.
to see you in the window at least.
Yeah.
My Jetta is for sale because I need a minivan.
All right.
Yes.
So anybody that needs a vehicle, get in touch with Titus.
Anyone local?
Yeah.
He's not going to drive it to you. That's what I'm picking up.
Maybe you come to
I'm
him.
just, yeah, I'm just owning the fact that we need a minivan, and I think it's so ironic that I'm 26 and we need a minivan that I'm just loving it, and I'm just gonna
Yeah.
buy like the dumpiest looking van and just like rock it.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Hey, Titus, that's what I have been doing for quite a few years now. Exactly.
Buy them
Right.
cheap, run the wheels off of them.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that I have taken to opening my prayers with. It's kind of my standard opening now as a constant reminder of what we've talked about. It's actually an opening, one of the openings in the Book of Common Prayer. Blessed be God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and blessed be His kingdom now and forever. And I like that continual reminder that this is about something more, like it's about something more than dying and going to heaven. It's about something more than
Right.
than my individual status with God. It's about a kingdom. It's about something way bigger than yourself. It's understanding what the kingdom is about makes such a huge difference in every aspect of the Christian life.
And it will make you feel hope instead of fear and anxiety. And that
Yeah.
matters a lot right now.
So we're gonna try it out. You'll like it.
Okay.
God bless you all.
All right, blessings,
Everybody.
Good night.
Deal.
Bye now.